If you've been following the news in the last few years, you may have seen this strange little story pop up every once in a while. And yes, I'm talking about the case of the so-called Havana Syndrome, in which American diplomats in Cuba and other places complained that they were being attacked by mysterious brain-melting microwaves.
New details on a series of bizarre attacks. Dozens of unexplained illnesses, including head injuries, forced the U.S. to bring home diplomatic staff from China and the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Speculation at the time was that it was some sort of sonic attack. But now the scientist who led the investigation tells the New York Times the main culprit is likely some kind of microwave weapon.
It's a microwave weapon. Now, this story broke conspicuously shortly after the Obama administration ended decades of hostility towards Cuba and began a process of normalizing relations. The alleged Cuban attacks on U.S. diplomats were used as a key reason for the Trump administration to reverse that policy. The U.S. government has now been investigating the Havana Syndrome for years, and the media has breathlessly reported it every step of the way, often using words like James Bond spy thriller to describe it. Now, this was in both the New Yorker story and in the 60 Minutes piece about it. They described it as a James Bond-like story. Now, I'm not a journalism professor like Anna Kasparian is, but if I were, one of my lessons would be if the story seems like it's something out of a James Bond movie, it's probably bullshit. But I digress. This week, the Biden administration quietly admitted that it is no longer calling the phenomenon the Havana Syndrome. This is from a Newsweek report. Havana Syndrome is the term widely used in the United States to describe symptoms reportedly suffered by staff at Washington's embassies in Cuba and other countries across the globe. But the Biden administration has quietly renamed the malady to cut the reference to the capital city in which it was first observed. We refer to these incidents as unexplained health incidents, or UHIs, a State Department spokesperson told Newsweek. Isn't that conspicuous? Well, of course, this barely got a notice in the U.S. media, but one person who did notice it was Dr. Jose Ramon Cabañas Rodriguez, who was the former Cuban ambassador to the United States. He tweeted out, "Some interesting developments. Havana Syndrome becomes UHI as U.S. backs down on blaming Cuba." Now, this whole business of the mysterious radio wave attacks on U.S. diplomats is almost too perfect a case study in how awful the media is when it comes to matters of national security. Every step of the way, the mainstream press has credulously presented the most inflammatory explanations for the phenomenon while ignoring any dissenting opinions or facts that may muddle the narrative. For example, last year, the National Academy of Sciences published its report commissioned by the State Department on what happened.
Last weekend, the National Academies of Sciences released the first authoritative government report concluding the victims were most likely hit by directed pulsed radio frequency energy. The lead author was Stanford microbiology and immunology professor David Relman.
That form of microwave radiation is really not terribly common in the world around us. It's sometimes used, for example, in radar systems. It sometimes is used in clinical medicine for treatment of certain ailments, but it's not common in the home around us or in the world that we normally frequent. And that's what makes it a little bit unusual, and the sort of the message behind it a little bit different.
The message: someone may have pointed a non-lethal weapon at U.S. government employees in order to harm them. And some former intelligence officials tell me that the perpetrator was likely Russia.
Now, this led to a wave of coverage. That guy was all over the place.
Stanford professor of medicine David Relman chaired the study.
We have neurologists on our committee that said afterwards, in my entire career of reading about countless hundreds and thousands of cases of neurologic injury, I've never heard of something like this.
This is really unique in the medical literature.
It is.
Politicians even started passing laws based on this and, quote, looking to hold someone accountable.
New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen has been fighting to get the victims medical assistance and answers about who did this.
If we don't hold those responsible accountable, then we can be sure it's going to continue to happen. And that's a national security risk to the United States and to our personnel.
Now, the next step of this usually is the intelligence agencies started leaking their own classified internal reports, this time about Big Bad Russia.
According to U.S. intelligence documents obtained by CNN, Russia has been developing this microwave attack capability for decades. Today, Bill Burns, President Biden's nominee to lead the CIA, telling Congress,
I will have no higher priority than taking care of people, of colleagues and their families. I will make it an extraordinarily high priority to get to the bottom of who's responsible for the attacks.
No higher priority at the CIA. What didn't get nearly as much coverage were the scientists who read the report and were highly skeptical of its findings. This is from BuzzFeed News. They write, however, experts in both microwaves and group psychology were highly critical of the report's conclusions. Quote, the report does not make a coherent argument why microwaves should be involved, said University of Pennsylvania bioengineer Kenneth Foster, who first described the mechanism behind the Frey effect in 1974. The effect requires very high power levels to produce barely audible sounds, he said, and it's not known to cause injuries. Maybe someone went to the trouble to truck in a large microwave transmitter to cause the employees to hear clicks, but there are simpler ways to harass people than that, he said. Another one said, quote, this is not science, but science fiction, said UCLA neurologist Robert Ballo, co-author of Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the Real Story Behind the Embassy Mystery and Hysteria. News reports alone, not considered by the panel, paint a picture of illnesses spreading through the patients in ways that look a lot like past group psychology outbreaks, Ballo said. There's a lot of misunderstanding these symptoms are real. People are really injured, even among physicians, he added. Now, this exact pattern is the same thing that we saw 3 years ago when the University of Pennsylvania published the first report on the Havana Syndrome in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. That report was the key basis for all of the media coverage on these supposed attacks. Again, dissenting voices were largely ignored, versus voices like that of Robert Bartholomew. This is from The Guardian. Robert Bartholomew, an expert in mass psychogenic illness, who teaches at Botany Downs Secondary College in Auckland, said he was, quote, floored by the study and claims that it reads like U.S. government propaganda. In the article, the doctors state that their objective is to describe neurological manifestations that followed exposure to an unknown energy source. But Bartholomew points out that there is no proof that any kind of energy source affected the diplomats or even that an attack took place. It's like the authors are trying to get us to believe an attack has occurred, he told The Guardian. Now, Natalie Shore, who often writes about health policy for Jacobin and other places, pointed out just how flawed that original JAMA study was. She tweeted, the JAMA studies on the so-called Havana Syndrome are perhaps the strongest piece of evidence wielded to make the case for both brain damage and attacks, but there were unusually significant problems with each, which are ignored in the new round of reporting. For one thing, symptoms included things like headaches, dizziness, and brain fog, all very common abnormalities reported in JAMA, used arbitrarily low threshold for abnormal, could have been caused by stress, anxiety, depression, etc., and didn't compare against appropriate control group. Concerningly, researchers dismissed psychogenic causes of illness with arguments that misunderstand what that even means. It doesn't mean patients are faking it. Their symptoms are and suffering are real. It's their attribution to mysterious hostile attacks that's in doubt. Okay, so now at this point, Natalie Shore began wondering, how did this paper even get past peer review? And the answer is, it almost didn't. UCLA neurologist Bob Ballo peer-reviewed it and recommended rejection. And she points experts in Bob Ballo's books in the case in which he recommended that they don't publish that report. Instead, JAMA moved forward with publication, motivated perhaps by a splashy politicized scoop, but hedged their bets by running it alongside a highly skeptical editorial that's been largely ignored. Now, that highly skeptical editorial that ran alongside the JAMA report was largely ignored by the media and everyone else, really. A fact that was pointed out by Mitchell Valdez Sosa, the director of the Cuban Center for Neurosciences. He wrote, this is from The Guardian, an editorial, this is quoting him, an editorial published alongside of the JAMA study, which also urges caution and calls for more evidence to be rigorously evaluated before people reach definitive conclusions. But Valdez Sosa points out that while the study is referenced on the U.S. State Department's website, which calls on people to reconsider travel to Cuba in light of health attacks, the editorial, which raises a long list of caveats, is not. This has been politicized, Valdez Sosa said. I think people are using this to push for the rolling back of the relationships that had started to blossom during Obama's presidency. In fact, after the study was published, a group of 15 scientists published a joint letter criticizing the findings. Again, as neuroscientists and physicians, and this is from their letter, as neuroscientists and physicists, we have no reason to dispute that U.S. diplomats living in Cuba heard loud noises or that they reported feeling ill afterwards. Some U.S. politicians have seized on these reports to construct conspiracy theories in which they imagine a mysterious disease-causing sound ray gun, something that isn't possible with today's technology. These same politicians have used their positions of authority to present their speculations to a credulous public as though they are fact. The pronouncements, in turn, have led to international confrontation and hysteria, resulting in the removal and expulsion of diplomats and travel advisories. A preliminary communication from the University of Pennsylvania with U.S. government support, published in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, has been used to buttress this putative acoustic attack idea with science. In fact, that work is deeply flawed and does nothing to support the attack theory. Even the FBI looked into the matter and found no evidence of an attack. Following months of investigation and 4 FBI trips to Havana, an interim report from the Bureau's Operational Technology Division says the probe has uncovered no evidence that sound waves could have damaged the Americans' health, the AP has learned. The FBI report, which hasn't been released publicly, is the clearest sign to date of the U.S. ruling out the sonic weapon theory. The report says the FBI tested the hypothesis that air pressure waves via audible sound, infrasound, or ultrasound could be used to clandestinely hurt Americans in Cuba and found no evidence. Again, this inconvenient bit of the narrative was inconvenient bit of information was largely left out of the narrative. Obama's thawing of relations with Cuba was one of his few genuinely good accomplishments. Sadly, it was rapidly undone by President Trump, and there's little indication that President Biden has any interest in re-implementing the policy that his former boss had towards Cuba. This business with the Havana Syndrome makes it almost impossible for Cuban diplomats to deal with American diplomats in a serious and productive way. I mean, what are they supposed to think when the Americans are accusing them of doing Dr. Evil-esque crimes? The idea that Cubans or Russians or whomever would have secret weapons technology that the U.S. doesn't know about, or indeed technology that the U.S. itself doesn't already possess, is utterly laughable. It's the kind of thing that falls apart when you think about it for just a few seconds. Yet that assumption has dominated U.S. diplomatic circles for years, aided and abetted by a credulous media. We must, as ever, remain skeptical of any story like this, stories that foment suspicions about America's official enemies, be they Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, North Korea, or Cuba. The reporting standards at news organizations drop dramatically when the accusation is leveled at one of those countries. Think about that whenever they try to tell you about fake news.
Yep. I mean, what more is there to add to it? I mean, as the timing is also so specific, right? Right after Obama approaches Cuba with diplomatic intentions, then we start hearing about the microwaves. Like, we start hearing about this attack. And the inability to really explain specifically what it was, right? Like this invisible weapon that's like targeted toward US diplomats. Like, it just seemed fishy from the get-go, which is why I feel like it kept reemerging in the news, like almost like testing Americans. Like, are they ready for this now? Like, can we scare them with this now? And it's like, it's not working. It'll fade into the background, then it'll come up again. But it is just amazing how these manufactured threats regarding our, foes come up over and over again. Like, I think the more ridiculous example during the tail end of the Trump administration was, that Russia was paying the Taliban bounties for U.S. soldiers. And it was like, what is your evidence for that? And they relied on one unnamed source and later had to retract that story. So you're right. You got to be super skeptical because, look, especially right now where you need global cooperation to combat the real national security threat, according to the Pentagon, by the way, which is climate change. Like, how are you going to work with Russia or China or, whoever the boogeyman is in any given administration, unless you are willing to put whatever interests or differences aside and focus on the real threat that we're already, by the way, suffering the consequences of. So but some people got mad at me because when we talked about the Havana Syndrome on TYT, like, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, we were just kind of making fun of it because the symptoms just sounded like jet lag. You know what
stress.
I mean?
Yeah.
Stress, jet lag. I'm like, I don't know. I could feel that way.
The
on any
stress
given
of like
week.
being the tip of the spear of the American empire and doing awful shit around the world like that.
Right.
That would stress me out.
Oh my
You know,
God.
like,
Yeah.
I mean, if we had more time, and if I had more time to prepare, which I admit I did not have as much time as I would have liked to, I would have included a lot of stuff. But the main kind of public whistleblower, for lack of a better term, or the main public voice, is this guy who's a CIA agent based in Russia, and he's like all over the media doing interviews about like his suffering at the hands of these dastardly Russians who are, you know, microwaving his brain. And it's just like the gall of all the reporting around it. It's like, well, he was in there doing intelligence operations in Russia. And like,
Yeah,
he's
I
like,
know.
they have no right to, you know, like he's a CIA agent. Like they say like they did have, like, it just seems utterly appropriate for, you know, a state to protect itself against, you know, foreign intelligence agents who are there doing all kinds of like, you know, destabilizing shit in their own country. Like that aspect of it was really funny.
Yeah.
But like, you know, Natalie took a lot of this research very seriously when she looked into it, and it seems pretty clear that that these symptoms are that there is something going on, that it's not just all they're all not just making it up, that there's enough kind of medical evidence that there is some sort of thing. But what seems pretty clear is that it's one of these kind of social diseases in which like you're in an environment, and it's a bit like mass hysteria, that like you're in an environment, you're in a sort of social world, and people start to feel sick, and that spreads not by some sort of virus, but it's like a sort of psychological effect that happens, a little bit like a version of like what a placebo, if like, you know, that a placebo can make you feel better. And it's like all in your head. It doesn't mean that they're lying about themselves, like they're feeling bad, but it's just, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's like this, that there's like this Bond villain in there with like this super technology that the US doesn't have, that the US doesn't possess.
Right.
Which is just utter, like the fact that they think that the Cubans have something that like the Cubans.
Oh, it's so good. I know. I mean, it is pretty incredible because on one hand, you know, there's the, you know, look at how awful Cuba is. They've got nothing. They're, you know, they can't do right by their own people. They're poor. And then on the other hand, they're like, they have this like super sophisticated biological weaponry that like it's invisible. And it's like, okay, sure.
And like
anyway,
highly targeted, like the degree of, you know, like they're not like just zapping an entire hotel or something, like that they can get to like a specific person within the thing. Like it's just so insane. It's so insane. But the media coverage is really breathtaking. Like you could do an entire book just on the media coverage of this one story. I mean, there's like too many examples to put into the piece, because it's crazy. If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.